Welcome to Drew's Storytime. If you enjoy falling asleep here, you're very welcome to subscribe for more gentle stories and peaceful meditations. Whether you're sitting or lying down, just allow yourself to get comfortable and let tonight's story carry you gently into rest. Tonight's story is The Room Where Music Rested. The room did not look like it had been prepared for listening. It was ordinary in the way rooms often were when they had been used carefully, rather than deliberately arranged. A chair sat slightly angled toward the window. A small table held nothing of importance. The walls carried a color that had faded gently rather than peeled, the result of years rather than neglect. Light entered without drama, settling where it could. Michelle stood just inside the doorway and paused. She did this each time she came in, not as a habit she had chosen, but as something her body seemed to require. The pause allowed the space to finish becoming itself around her. The room felt different when it was empty, different again when she stood within it. Neither state felt incomplete. She crossed to the sideboard and opened the lid of the record player. The hinge moved smoothly, its sound familiar enough to register without drawing attention. Inside, the turntable waited, matte and still. Michelle selected a record from the shelf beside it, running her thumb along the edge before lifting it free. The sleeve was worn at the corners, softened by years of handling. She placed the record carefully on the spindle. The movement was slow and precise, not ceremonial, just practiced. She adjusted the speed and waited until the platter reached its steady rotation. The room held its breath, not in anticipation, but in readiness. Michelle lowered the needle. The first sound was not music but contact, a faint textured whisper as the needle settled into the groove. Then the sound widened, forming itself into something recognizable without insisting on attention. The music entered the room gradually, finding its place rather than claiming it. She moved to the chair and sat. The chair faced the window rather than the record player. Michelle preferred it that way. The music did not need to be watched. It needed to be allowed. The window showed a view of rooftops and sky. Nothing remarkable, just enough openness to prevent the room from closing in on itself. The sound filled the space without pushing. It settled along the walls, rested briefly on the floor, softened against the ceiling. The room accepted it easily, as though it had been holding the right shape all along. Michelle noticed how the sound did not replace the room's quiet. It layered itself over it, adding depth rather than noise. She didn't think about the music as belonging to a particular time. She knew when it had been recorded. She knew the names associated with it. None of that mattered now. In this room, the music existed without history, freed from its origin and destination. It became something that simply happened. Michelle leaned back slightly and rested her hands on the arms of the chair. The fabric beneath her palms was worn smooth, where others had rested their hands before. The room held traces of use, without insisting they be interpreted. The music continued. Some passages rose, others softened. None of it demanded reaction. Michelle did not follow the melody or anticipate changes. She let the sound arrive and leave as it chose, trusting the sequence without monitoring it. She became aware of how the room responded. Certain notes seemed to linger longer near the corner where the walls met unevenly. Others dissipated quickly, absorbed by the heavy curtain near the window. The room shaped the music as much as the record did, filtering it through its own quiet architecture. Light moved across the floor. It shifted gradually, changing the angle of shadow near the table leg, brightening a patch of wall that had been dull moments earlier. The music did not acknowledge the change. It continued at its own pace, indifferent to what could be seen. Michelle closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again. The room did not change when she did. It remained consistent, offering itself as a container rather than a participant. She felt no need to disappear into the sound. Being present alongside it felt sufficient. The music reached the end of the first side. Michelle breathed evenly. The rhythm of her breathing aligned with the slower passages without effort. When the music shifted, her breathing did not follow. The two existed alongside one another, neither leading nor resisting. The final notes did not announce themselves as final. They thinned, resolved, and then gave way to the soft, circular sound of the needle, tracing the run-out groove. The sound repeated, gentle and mechanical, a reminder that the music had rested, but not vanished. Michelle did not stand immediately. She let the repeating sound exist for a moment, listening to its steadiness. The room absorbed it differently than the music itself. It felt more functional, less expressive, yet no less welcome. She stood and lifted the needle. The silence that followed was not abrupt. It arrived with the same care as the music had, filling the space gradually, rather than cutting it short. The room held the quiet easily, as though nothing had been interrupted. Michelle returned the record to its sleeve and set it back on the shelf. She did not replace it with another. One side felt complete. The room did not ask for continuation. It felt settled, balanced in a way that did not require more. She sat again. Without the music, the room revealed its other sounds. A faint hum from somewhere within the building, the distant movement of air through a gap she had never sealed, the soft sound of her own clothing shifting as she adjusted her position. The absence of music did not feel like loss. It felt like space regained. She looked toward the record player once more. The lid remained open, the turntable still. Michelle felt no obligation to close it immediately. The openness felt appropriate. The room continued to hold itself. It did not echo the music that had passed through it. It simply remained, unchanged and accommodating, ready to hold whatever came next, or nothing at all. Michelle remained seated, aware of the way the room had received sound and released it without keeping score. The music had not filled the space. It had rested there. The silence settled gradually. It did not replace the music so much as expand into the space it had shaped. Michelle noticed how the room seemed slightly larger, without sound tracing its edges, as though the walls had relaxed once their role as boundaries was no longer required. The quiet held texture now. It was not empty. It carried the faint imprint of what had passed through it. She remained seated for a while. Her hands rested where they had been, fingers relaxed, palms open. The room asked nothing further of her attention, and that absence of demand felt deliberate rather than accidental. She thought about how sound behaved differently once it was gone. Silence made no such claim to continuity. It existed only as itself, complete in each moment, without needing reference to what came before or after. The room accepted that distinction easily. Michelle stood and crossed to the window. Outside, the day had advanced without waiting. Light now struck the rooftops directly, drawing sharper lines where earlier there had been suggestion. A patch of cloud moved across the sky, its shadow passing slowly over brick and slate. The movement was gentle enough that it felt unintentional, as though the sky itself were thinking aloud. She opened the window a few inches. The sound that entered was layered. Distant voices, softened by space. The brief clatter of something being set down. A vehicle passing without urgency. The outside world made itself known without insisting on recognition. The room adjusted again, letting the new sounds sit alongside its quiet. Michelle leaned lightly against the frame. The air felt cooler here, carrying a trace of the outside that did not overwhelm the interior. The room allowed the boundary to remain flexible, its shape defined more by use than by structure. She thought about how often she had filled rooms with sound, music while working, voices from a screen, noise used as a marker of presence. This room had taught her something different. Sound, when allowed to rest rather than perform, left behind a steadiness that noise never did. Michelle returned to the record player and closed the lid gently. The click was soft, barely noticeable. She traced the edge of the sideboard with her fingers. The wood held the warmth of the room now, its surface no longer cool. The furniture had been here longer than she had, shaping itself to years of quiet use. She sat again, this time facing the center of the room. Without the orientation toward the window, the space felt more contained. She noticed how the absence of music allowed her to hear her own breathing more clearly, not as something separate, but as part of the room's ongoing soundscape. Her thoughts drifted, unanchored. They did not return to specific memories associated with the music. Instead, impressions rose and fell without forming stories. A sense of familiarity, a feeling of ease, a recognition that something had been completed without requiring explanation. Time moved quietly. The light shifted almost imperceptibly, altering the color of the walls and the depth of shadow near the corners. The change felt continuous rather than segmented, as though the day was smoothing itself out. She stood and moved toward the doorway. The pause returned naturally, without intention. She stood just inside the threshold and looked back at the room once more. It did not present itself as something finished. It remained open, ready to hold sound again, or to remain as it was. Michelle stepped out and closed the door. The click was gentle, final, without being conclusive. The room continued on without her, holding the quiet it had been given, neither preserving it nor discarding it. She moved down the hallway toward the rest of the day. The steadiness she carried from the room did not fade. It settled into her movement, shaping the pace of what came next without directing it. The music had passed through and gone, but its absence remained balanced, contained, and sufficient. The hallway felt narrower after the room, its edges clearer now that she was moving again. Michelle walked slowly, allowing the shift from stillness to motion to complete itself without resistance. She paused in the kitchen. Light entered more fully here, spreading across the table and catching on the rim of a glass left from earlier. The room held the practical order of daily use. Surfaces were clear, but not bare. Objects waited where they belonged. The contrast with the listening room felt natural rather than abrupt, as though each space had agreed on its role. Michelle filled the kettle and set it back on its base. The quiet from the other room had shifted with her, loosening her pace without slowing it. While the water warmed, she stood at the sink and looked out. A stretch of pavement, a parked car, the suggestion of trees further off. The ordinariness felt grounding. The morning had progressed without ceremony, and the world beyond the window reflected that same restraint. The kettle reached its boil and eased back into silence. Michelle poured the water and carried her mug to the table, sitting without thought as to where or why. The heat moved into her hands gradually. She noticed how her shoulders lowered a fraction, not in relief, but in alignment. She drank slowly. Each sip arrived without expectation and left without afterthought. The absence of music did not create a void. It allowed other rhythms to become audible. Michelle finished her drink and stood, rinsing the mug before placing it back in its place. The action closed a small loop, complete without significance. She moved back toward the listening room. The door remained closed. Michelle rested her hand briefly against the wood. The surface felt solid and familiar beneath her palm. She did not open it. Some spaces held themselves better when left alone. She stepped away and continued on. The rest of the day waited in its usual shape, made up of tasks and pauses, conversations and intervals of quiet. The steadiness she carried required no protection. It had already settled into place. As she moved through the house, the absence of sound remained present in a different way. Not as silence, but as balance. The music had rested and moved on. The room had received it and released it. Michelle carried forward with the same ease, her pace guided by something quieter than intention. The door stayed closed behind her. Inside, the room remained ready, unchanged and accommodating, holding the memory of sound only in the way it held air. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like, comment, share and subscribe. Thank you for supporting the channel.